Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." So just briefly, we can see here how Jesus treated Zacchaeus with grace. And grace, I think grace has 2 sides to it. It's like a coin with 2 sides. The first side is invitation. So Zacchaeus is being invited into relationship with Jesus. And I think that's what grace does in our lives. Grace is God inviting us into relationship with him. And in that relationship with God, we receive all kinds of benefits. We're loved, we're welcomed, we're forgiven, we're healed, we're made new. All of that happens because of that relationship with God that we're invited into. But I think the flip side of grace is the challenge. Okay, now I've been invited into a relationship with God, but when I'm in relationship with God, I'm suddenly confronted with the reality of how far my life falls short of who God is and who God is calling me to be. And so then the challenge is almost inherent in that of, okay, well, if I fall so far short, then God, what do you want me to become? And how does that challenge how I'm living now? If I'm going to be healed and made new, that means some stuff has to change. Something needs to be different. So in this story, Jesus draws near to Zacchaeus and he offers him the invitation. "Zacchaeus, I want to come over to your house. Zacchaeus, I want to sit down and eat with you. I want to stay with you." And for Zacchaeus, a tax collector, a chief tax collector, he's a man who's used to being an outsider. It also says he's short. So you can just picture, here's a guy who's been pushed around by people most of his life. Pushed aside, cast aside, ignored. And then he's somehow climbed to the status of chief tax collector. You don't get there by accident. Usually to become a tax collector, you have to buy your way in. And so he's bought his way in and he's climbed the ladder of success. So now he's got subordinates, he's got servants, and he's basically making a living by betraying his people to the Romans, collecting their money, giving it to Rome. So he's pretty well just generally seen as a pretty bad guy. Pushed aside because he's short, cast aside because he's a tax collector. And Jesus says, "Zacchaeus, I want to visit with you." That's the grace, right? That's the invitation. "Zacchaeus, I want a relationship with you. You have worth to me. You are someone still deserving of dignity, still deserving of respect, not because of your life, but because of who I am, because of who Jesus is." So Jesus offers him dignity and respect and invites him into relationship. But inherent in that invitation is also the challenge. And so Zacchaeus, in this story, you see him wrestling with that, recognizing that something in his life needs to change if he's going to be in a relationship with Jesus. So this morning, as we receive communion, and then as we eat together, communion for me is the most beautiful picture we have of the Christian life. It's the most significant thing we do together as a religious action. In this action of receiving bread and wine, we are invited into grace. We're invited into relationship with Jesus. We're reminded of everything that means, of the cost that it cost God for us to be invited into relationship with him. We're invited into relationship with one another. And we're invited to be a church that's unified, that we forgive each other just as God has forgiven us. We're at the table, then we are also sent out. We gather and then we're sent and released into the world, where we gather around other tables. We gather around tables downstairs. We gather around tables in our home. We gather around lunch tables at work. We gather around tables all the time in different places. And in each of those places, we are invited now to take this presence of Jesus with us and to be Jesus in those places, to invite others into the grace of God, and to gently speak when it's appropriate, when the Spirit leads us, speak words that challenge the systems of righteousness that we build up, that try to make us feel like we're good enough. So I just want to share briefly a note from Bishop Cliff's notes this week. He shared about his dad. And his dad was a man who received grace. And so this is what he wrote. He said, "My dad had a beautiful and life-changing Jesus encounter only a few years ago. Jesus gave him a dream. Dad says Jesus sat beside him on a park bench and they talked about Dad's life. Jesus assured Dad that he loved him and he forgave him. And Dad has talked about this ever since. In the hospital room this week, a nice nurse said to him, 'Mr. Fletcher, you're a nice man. You will get to the pearly gates.' Dad opened his eyes, which had become quite a tiring chore lately, and said, 'Oh no, you don't get into heaven by being good. I will be going to heaven because Jesus loves me and forgives me.'" Just a beautiful, simple way to share that invitation and the challenge. You're invited into relationship with Jesus, but it also means a challenge that all this stuff we do to make us feel like we're good enough for God doesn't matter. That's not what Jesus is marking. It's not what he's measuring. He's inviting us into a changed life because we're loved, not in order to be loved. And communion is that place we're reminded of that. Every time we do it, we are loved because Jesus invites us. And then out of that love, we're invited to go to be changed people and to change our world. Is that short enough? And we can go get some soup. All right.